Hello and welcome to this lecture on the Vietnam War, and more so the causes and origins of the Vietnam War rather than the war itself. And the war itself is something, if you're interested in this topic, you can explore via possibly watching movies about Vietnam, which are often depicted in a fairly accurate way, and there are countless books and documentaries on the war itself. But we're more interested in the kind of political factors that draw the United States into this conflict in the 1960s. Let's begin with a little bit of background information just to kind of give you a sense of what the United States were getting themselves into, and then we'll start to look at why they found themselves in this position of being involved in a long drawn out guerrilla war that goes on right up until 1975 when American troops finally leave Vietnam. So question one is, where is Vietnam? Well, for those of you who are good at geography, you might be able to identify this country because it's got quite a unique shape to it. Here is the northern part of the country, here's the southern part of the country, and you've got this very narrow part of it here. And the north is where we find Hanoi, the main city during the Vietnam War, where the communists, or the communist government, were located. And then way down in the south we have Saigon, which is nowadays referred to as Ho Chi Minh City, but Saigon was the capital of the southern part of Vietnam, and this is where their government was run from. So this is the place that we're going to be focusing on. I guess in terms of the kind of wider geography, it's part of Southeast Asia, an area where I guess the Americans believed was kind of edging into their sphere of influence, because here is obviously the Pacific. The Philippines had been an American colony. That's not to say that America wanted Vietnam to become an American colony, but she definitely didn't want it to become a communist state, as we will see. So this is Vietnam, linked to a few other areas that were part of what we call French Indochina. That includes Cambodia and Laos up here as well. And Cambodia actually plays quite an important part in the Vietnam War, because it is in this little area of Cambodia here that North Vietnamese assistance would come down to the south along what was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which kind of troops manoeuvred their way through part of Cambodia to get down to kind of the Saigon region. This is the question that really you're going to have to grasp with for any assessment on this topic. Why were the United States in Vietnam? It's a rhetorical question in some respects, but it's a very important question to try and answer, because we are talking about a particular context, and that context is the post World War II period, the beginnings of the Cold War. So the United States are in Vietnam really for that reason alone. They are there because they truly believe that they have to free Vietnam from any communist influence. So really the story that we're going to be looking at today is this attempt by the United States to keep Vietnam, in their words, free and democratic. Ironically, the part of Vietnam that the United States were back in, the south, was anything but free and democratic, but it wasn't communist. Okay, this is a question really that can have a few answers, but if you want to take a kind of short-term approach, you would mostly focus on the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. If you want to kind of look at a kind of longer way into the Vietnam War, then you would go as far back as the Truman administration. All of these presidents that are listed here played a part in the Vietnam War. Truman, who is the individual who starts off by supporting the French post-World War II and their attempts to reclaim Vietnam, which we're going to come to in a moment. Eisenhower, who escalates American involvement in Vietnam post-France. Kennedy is then left with Eisenhower's problem. Johnson is then left with Kennedy's problem, and then Nixon is then left with Johnson's problem. Nixon is the man who really brings the war to an end, but he doesn't bring the war to an end in the way that he had stated he would. He brings the war to an end with what is known as the Vietnamization of the problem, i.e. get the Vietnamese to deal with their own issues So the South Vietnamese really had to therefore defend themselves against the North Vietnamese communist government and troops. That had really been the aim of every president from Eisenhower, Kennedy and Johnson, but Nixon really makes a big deal of it. But as he's doing this, he's illegally bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail in neutral Cambodia. So, American involvement, I guess you could say, is from 55 to 75, when Eisenhower starts to assist the Vietnamese, right through until Nixon brings the war to a close. And there is, well, I say Nixon brings the war to a close. It's not necessarily Nixon, because he's got his own problems by that point. But we've also got another argument that it could go back as far as Truman, because Truman is the man in 1945 who has a decision to make, and his decision, I guess in some respects, to kind of assist the French is going to have kind of long-term consequences for all of these subsequent presidents. Okay, who was the enemy for the Americans? Well, we can really answer this question in a simple way first and foremost, and then we can answer it in a complicated way, right? And I'm going to give you kind of both answers if you wish. So I guess the simple way is that the enemy is the communist ideology, right? Communism is the enemy for the United States. What does communism mean in Vietnam? Well, it means that there are communist groups who have developed and emerged throughout the kind of 1920s, 30s, 40s, and they really see the future of Vietnam post-World War II as being better served under a communist government, right? This type of communism, however, is also a communist ideology with a large strain of nationalism included as well, right? Which is a point we'll come back to later on, something that the Americans might not have necessarily focused on enough. The communists were, after 1956, were the North Vietnamese government, right? Because Vietnam is split into two countries, South Vietnam and North Vietnam. But the way that the country had kind of been left at the time of division was that there were many communists, those who wanted a united, free Vietnam, free from the French, free from any American involvement. They were still located in the south, right? And we call the group who were located in the south before World War II ends and during the French reoccupation of the 40s and early 50s, we call that group the Viet Minh. Now the Viet Minh are eventually, their name changes, right? They're eventually known as the National Liberation Front, who are kind of guerrilla fighters located in the south, right? But they are in favour of reuniting the country with the north and having it most likely under communist rule. The National Liberation Front eventually take on a more organised kind of force, right? They're called the PLAF, right? The People's Liberation Armed Forces. So they are there in the south to liberate South Vietnam. But nobody really calls them the PLAF, nobody really calls them the National Liberation Front. They are more often than not known as the Viet Cong, which is a kind of shorthand from South Vietnamese fighters opposed to communism. That is a shorthand for Vietnamese communists. The Viet Cong, actually sometimes when even referred to by American troops as just VC, and if you watch any movies you'll hear about VC, and that is when American troops are also referring to these guerrilla fighters supporting the North Vietnamese government, but they're fighting and are situated in the south. In fact, VC is often just then reduced again to the phonetic alphabet, which is Victor, Charlie, and again in movies about the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong are often referred to as Charlie, and that is purely because the C stands for, in the phonetic alphabet, Charlie, and that was to represent communism or communists. It gets more complicated, don't worry, because you also have the North Vietnamese government, and they have their own army. They're there, and they've got their own political party as well. You've got the Vietnamese kind of working party, right, which is the kind of communist party. But the government in the north have their own army, so a kind of proper organised state-run army known as the PAVN, right, or the People's Army of Vietnam, sometimes known as VPA, but more often than not, when the Americans refer to the North Vietnamese Army, they call them NVA. So you'll hear about the NVA, North Vietnamese Army, and VC, Viet Cong, who are the guerrilla forces. Eventually, the North Vietnamese Army will make their way to the south and will assist the Viet Cong, or the National Liberation Front. On the side of the Americans is a group called the ARVN, which is the South Vietnamese Army. So whenever you see ARVN, ARVN, that is the South Vietnamese Army who are fighting with the Americans against the NVA and the Viet Cong. So that's the kind of two sides that fight in this war. Who won the war? I guess we can answer this question now because I'm not going to cover the war itself, but most historians argue that the United States did not win it. And if they didn't win it, well, I guess you could say they lose it. But they kind of pull out before they lose the war, because when Vietnam becomes a unified country, the Americans are gone. And but it's very easy for the North to bring the country together and make the whole country controlled under communist rule once the Americans leave. So the Vietnamese lose the North Vietnamese lose the majority of battles, but they win the war, and that's because America just can't carry on with this war after very much close to 10 years of fighting guerrilla warfare. So it's a humiliation for the United States in many respects. Did the American people support the war? Well, this is an interesting one, because if you look at opinion polls, as late as 1967 there was still a lot of support for the war. It's not really until 1968 that people really start to turn against the war. And you've got high profile figures by then speaking out against the war, like Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And you have also got just ordinary people, students, trade unions, workers who oppose civil rights movement as well, who oppose the Vietnam War, and who will eventually take to the streets and take to the Capitol, as you can see in this second image, to oppose the war. Lyndon Johnson basically woke up every morning, in fact his wife complained every morning about being woken up to student protesters outside her window at the White House saying, or singing LBJ, LBJ, how many kids will you kill today? So it was very much a movement that persisted from 1964 right up until 68, when Johnson decides to leave office and doesn't run for his second term. But as I said, you did have support, and support came from quite often working class communities, middle class communities across the country, maybe not so much in your Californias or your kind of New Yorks or the kind of more urban industrial areas. And there was this view that the Vietnam War was necessary. We'll come back to historiography in a moment, but historiography I guess reflects to some extent the views of the American government, but also the views of the American people, and the view that was often spread from government to the people was that war was necessary because Vietnam, if it was to become communist, then what would the impact of that be on the United States and the free world? So there was support. It's not until, as I said, later on, you remember America goes to war in 65, so it's a couple of years before the country turns against the war, and even then there are some people who don't ever really turn against it. They support American foreign policy no matter what, but obviously body bags coming back to the United States of young men killed in the war, and many of these body bags filmed and photographed. Those images obviously did not go down well across the country. So that's the kind of context, if you like, to what we're about to discuss. And you might also know other things about the Vietnam War, and if you are interested in this topic, it might lead you to the decision that this is the question that you might like to be assessed on. So all of the information I'm going to now run through, and all the information that is on My City, are obviously going to be critical to any assessment on this topic. Okay, so here we are, the causes of the Vietnam War. We're going to go as far back as 1954. In fact, we're actually going to start very briefly with the period 45 to 54, but 54 is when the Americans start to get involved. Now, to truly understand the situation in Vietnam, we have to look at the influence of other major powers, right? And there are, the history of Vietnam is having four major global powers um, involved in Vietnamese affairs and Vietnamese life. And it's the French initially, but if you go even further, way back, centuries back, you have the Chinese. And then you've got the Japanese, and then you've got the United States. And all of these kind of examples of infiltration into Vietnam, or colonialism of Vietnam, or full out war against Vietnam, it's obviously going to instill and create a form of nationalism. And the Vietnamese people, right, as much as they were kind of drawn towards communism, they were nationalist, maybe even first and foremost. And that is because of how they had been treated over the course of centuries. There is a little video clip here, it doesn't last long at all, right? You can watch it in your own time from 11 minutes to 26 minutes on My City within this sway presentation that's on My City. And it gives a really good potted history of, Vietnam as a French colony in 1860 down to 1945, when the Americans are crucial in the liberation of Vietnam. And that's a really important story that we're going to touch on, right? We're going to touch on the initial relationship between the Vietnamese and the United States, and how there could have been a very different outcome, a very different story to the relationship between these two countries, which incidentally is actually pretty good in 2020. Relationships have definitely improved in the new century between Vietnam and the United States. In this little video clip, you will learn about obviously French occupation and French colonialism, and then that is replaced by Japanese occupation, because the French are defeated not just by the Germans in the Blitzkrieg of 1939 and 1940, but they are also defeated in the east by the Japanese. And Japanese control is particularly cruel, and the Vietnamese people suffer from famine, from severe hunger, as well as Japanese abuse during this occupation. And Japan, as you might recall from discussions we had about American reasons maybe for intervention in World War II, Japan had wanted to set up this kind of economic co-prosperity sphere, and Vietnam would play a key part within that. There were natural resources and raw materials within Vietnam and that region that could be useful to foreign powers. Why are the Japanese eventually kicked out? Well, they lose World War II, but they're also being challenged by guerrilla fighters in Vietnam, and they are led by Ho Chi Minh and the group that I mentioned earlier, the Viet Minh, right, who will eventually become the Viet Cong. And the Japanese and the hatred of the Japanese really turns a lot of people towards Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is seen as being the saviour. He's the kind of leader of the resistance group, this Viet Minh, and he's obviously going to become a figure of real importance, right? He's revered by the Vietnamese people in the 1940s and 50s, and also the 60s as well before he dies. He, will steal, and his men will steal rice from the Japanese. They will redistribute this rice and food to starving Vietnamese. So that is really the story of this little video. And the video ends with a plane flying over a crowd in Hanoi, September 1945, and this is an American plane, and the crowd who are there to hear Ho Chi Minh read his Declaration of Independence, which we'll come to in a second, they see this American plane and they cheer because they think this is fantastic, this is brilliant, here are the Americans who have helped us get rid of the Japanese, surely we can work with our American liberators. The Americans who were involved in Vietnam were known as the OSS, right, the Office for Strategic Services, which is the precursor to the CIA. So the CIA assist Ho Chi Minh, even though they kind of know that the Viet Minh are probably, edging towards communism. At this point, the priority was to defeat the Japanese. But Ho Chi Minh truly believes that the Americans are anti-colonialist, and he believes that the Americans can be their friends, right, and an ally for Vietnam. So the context of this desire for good relations between Vietnam and America have to be viewed within the bigger picture of the new threat that was emerging for the Americans, which was the Cold War, and how to deal with the Soviet Union post-World War II. So this is a a major issue. And as you know, Roosevelt dies and he's replaced by Truman, and Truman is more anti-communist. He is less pragmatic than Roosevelt when it came to dealing with the Soviet Union. So Vietnam has won its kind of independence, or it would appear to have won its independence. Ho Chi Minh is about to declare independence, which he does do, and the Americans have a decision to make. Do they recognise Vietnamese independence and accept that this is a new country, irrespective if it goes down a communist route or a more democratic route, inverted commas? Will the United States stand by France, or stand by as France, I should say, attempts to reconquer its lost colony? I don't mean to sound anti-French, right, but there's a bit of a cheek here of the French. They've really not contributed much to the Second World War in terms of defending their country in Europe against Nazism, and they haven't really done much in the East to defend Vietnam from Japan, and here they want their colony back, right, which completely goes against the Atlantic Charter which Roosevelt and Churchill had signed prior to Pearl Harbor in 1941. So will the US just let the French on with it? Or, third scenario, surely the worst scenario of all, will the US actively assist the French in their recolonisation of Vietnam? Let's see what option America goes for, 1, 2 or 3. Here is a copy of the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. You can see the date on it there, the 2nd of September 1945, spoken by Ho Chi Minh as this American kind of airplane flies over the crowd, and people are really excited when they hear the words of Ho Chi Minh, which are lifted, plagiarised in some respects, right at the beginning from the American Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. So all men are created equal, and then he just carries on, right? And he even states this, a model statement was made in the United States Declaration of Independence in 1776. He obviously then goes on right further and then throws in some points that might have been seen as being a bit more radical or revolutionary, but further down he even says that, you know, the Japanese are to blame for a lot of the problems, as have been the French, where he says they have hampered the prospering of our national bourgeoisie, they have mercilessly exploited our workers. That is directed against the Japanese and the French, right? The fact that Ho Chi Minh is even talking about the establishment of a Vietnamese bourgeoisie might suggest he's not as radical as kind of your traditional kind of communists. He might have still been a Marxist who truly believed that you needed a bourgeoisie before you could move on to the next phase within society, but he's not a direct threat. An independent Vietnam is not a direct threat. An independent communist Vietnam would not appear to be a direct threat to the United States. So Truman has kind of got a decision to make. I should also say that during this point, Ho Chi Minh writes letters to Truman on, I think, 6 or 7 occasions. He writes letters and receives no responses at all from Truman. And the letters he writes to Truman are really, we can be friends, we can be allies. Truman rejects it, he turns it down, and that is because the context of this Declaration of Independence, this appeal for American friendship, is denied because of the new Cold War that is emerging, partly also because of Ho Chi Minh's politics, but also because President Truman wants to really be this strongman figure. He's already kind of started this approach with the dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he does not want to see himself being regarded as weak when it comes towards communism. Now, because of the Cold War, right, the priority for the United States is Europe, and having a Europe that can be created in such a way that it would stop any Soviet encroachment. And we know that obviously the Soviets do encroach in Eastern Europe, and to stop that happening in Western Europe, then there had to be maybe some type of attempt to ensure French support for the Americans and for America's kind of anti-Soviet, anti-communist position. There was a massive communist party in Italy and a massive communist party in France at the end of World War II. And the French, again the audacity of the French, is that they basically blackmail Truman, right, and they blackmail Americans and say, look, if you don't help us get our colony back, right, French Indochina, which you can see away down here on the map, and here's France obviously over here. If America did not kind of ensure that they were supporting and kind of willing to back French attempts to, I guess, raise their prestige, which had been seriously damaged during World War II by reclaiming French Indochina, then the French said, well, do you know what, we may have to do some deals with Stalin. So the French do kind of act in a rather despicable way at the end of World War II. There are boats, there are ships coming back with American troops from Asia, right? They've been fighting in the war during Asia, and they come back via Europe, right? And when they, some of them, these ships port at Marseille, and but they're obviously these boats' final destination is the United States. Troops are told to get off. American troops are told to get off because the boats are going to go back taking French troops. And when I say French troops, most of these French troops came from North Africa. It wasn't even French citizens who were necessarily going, who didn't want to go. It was from the French colonies in North Africa who were sent back on these ships to Indochina to ensure that Vietnam would not become independent. So this question of what was the response of Eisenhower? Did he follow Truman's policy of not standing back, not supporting independence? He opts for number 3 on that list. He says, do you know what, we will aid you. In fact, the aid that Truman himself gives to the French is kind of remarkable, right? In the first year alone, $23 million dollars makes its way to France. Eventually, by the time that Eisenhower's presidency comes to an end, or the Eisenhower assistance comes to an end for the French, it's closer to $2.6 billion that America gives to the French in military and economic aid to ensure that Vietnam could remain a colony. So all the kind of promises of what the world would be like after the Second World War are kind of lost, and the Vietnamese are not given their right to self-determination, which Roosevelt obviously had favoured. So Eisenhower does follow Truman's policy. In fact, you might even argue he has no choice but to follow Truman's policy. And Eisenhower, however, he did have a way out. We'll see the way out that he has in a moment. He doesn't take the way out for America because Eisenhower truly believed in this new idea or new theory that we refer to as domino theory. And you can go to your sources, which you'll find on My City. There's a little documents sources booklet there with I think 5 different sources on it. And the first one is from Eisenhower. And in this source, Eisenhower argues a couple of things, right? The first thing he argues is that Vietnam is part of this domino theory. And if Vietnam falls to communism, then would follow other Southeast Asian countries. And he lists them here, right? Like Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh. They would all fall one after the other, and Asia would become communist. That would be a major concern for the United States because their markets, the capitalist markets that they want and have always wanted, are often located in this part of the world. So yes, this is partly about stopping communism, but it's also about the extension of capitalism. Just to quote a little bit from Eisenhower's speech from April 7th, 1954, he says, one of the reasons why this is an important area is because of the amount of tin and tungsten that can be found in this part of the world. Very important kind of elements. But also rubber plantations within this part of the world. America, being the automobile nation of the world, would like access to tin, tungsten, and very much so rubber. So you've also got, I guess you could say, if you take a Marxist approach, this is not just about stopping communism, this is about American economic imperialism. This is about having as much control over this part of the world as possible so as to further your economic interest and the economic ideology of capitalism. Many people who were involved in the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, they were economists who truly believed that the best way to ensure the kind of future of American capitalism or global capitalism was to try and impose it upon third world countries as they were known at this point. So domino theory is now in place, and it will definitely influence Kennedy and Johnson, who kind of have to accept this domino theory. Eisenhower's vice president is one Richard Nixon, and Nixon also truly believes in domino theory, and you already know that Nixon was virulently anti-communist. So the period of 1945 to 54 is the period in which the French try and maintain the control of their former colony. They try and also reoccupy it. Over this period, they fail dramatically. They struggle because of the real resentment that exists within Vietnam towards the French, especially when the Vietnamese had liberated themselves from the Japanese. They felt that they were more than ready to become an independent country. A guerrilla war takes place, and eventually this guerrilla war ends at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May 1954, when the French are surrounded by Vietnamese communist troops, the Viet Minh, and as I said, in spite of all the military assistance given to the French, they can't defeat this army. They're never going to defeat this army because this is a war against the Vietnamese on their own terrain. And the Vietnamese were not a conventional army, they didn't wear uniforms, so the French really struggled to fight against this guerrilla force. You would think the Americans would have taken stock of the problems that the French had. So France are looking for a way out, and they get the way out when they realise that their attempts to reoccupy Vietnam have been a complete disaster. They get their way out in 1954 when a peace treaty is agreed. Now, one of the questions that's often asked about Vietnam is, why was there not more American intervention to ensure victory? Now that starts with Eisenhower and it carries on with Johnson. In fact, one of the things that I guess Johnson had to deal with was America at this point had nuclear weapons, and there were some military hawks saying to Johnson, just nuke them, nuke the Vietnamese. And Johnson obviously did not favour that, thankfully, that option. Johnson just couldn't get his head around how Vietnam couldn't be defeated by the military might of the United States. I mean, he really struggled to, I think he referred to Vietnam as a raggedy ass little country, and he asked the question, how can the United States not defeat this raggedy ass little country? But the reason maybe why is because the Americans didn't go all in, and Eisenhower didn't favour an all-in policy, Kennedy didn't favour an all-in policy, and Johnson, even though there were hundreds of thousands of American troops in Vietnam, didn't really favour an all-in policy. Eisenhower had seen what had happened in the Korean War immediately after World War II, and in the Korean War, which was another battle between communism and the so-called democratic free world, located within Korea, right, so it's kind of one of the first proxy wars of the Cold War. 34,000 American troops were killed in Korea, and it's maybe a reason as to why Eisenhower didn't want to send troops into Vietnam. There's a source, source 2, you can read it again in your own time. It's a testimony of a Vietnamese fighter fighting against the French during the battles right up until 1954 when the French are kicked out. And the kind of real desire to protect Vietnam from foreign invaders is expressed within this source. The levels of discomfort that Viet Minh soldiers would go to ensure success, what they would endure was quite remarkable. And I'm not sure if Eisenhower really wanted to throw America into a situation in which the French really struggled to defeat this type of guerrilla warfare, this type of guerrilla army. And therefore the reluctance of the United States always was, do we really want to get bogged down in a conflict that we might not probably be able to fully win? And if you go back, as you know, 50 odd years or 60 odd years to the Balangiga era, and the first kind of example of American overseas intervention or occupation in the Philippines, that was a war as well. It was very difficult for the Americans to win. So Source 2 is quite a good example maybe of the reluctance of the Americans to go all in. Now let's go back to the kind of end of French occupation or French rule. It comes to an end in 1954 with the Geneva Accords. The Geneva Accords, you can read extracts from it in Source 3, the kind of terms of it. The agreement really was to split the country, and I'll show you this on the next map, split the country into two, Laos would become independent, you can see that in purple, Cambodia in blue would become independent, but Vietnam would become North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and North Vietnam would be controlled by the communists, South Vietnam would be controlled by a democratic government backed obviously now by the Americans. So they're split into the DRV and the GVN. You don't have to worry too much about those terms, just use the term North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Now, in this scenario, the terms of the Geneva Agreements or the Geneva Accords was that in 1956, 2 years after the Accords, there would have to be an election, and the election would unite the country again. In 1954, the leader of the South was this guy you can see in the picture here, Ngo Diem, and Diem was, backed by Eisenhower, who you can see shaking hands with him here. So Diem is a bit of a puppet. I mean, he's not completely a puppet, right? But he's propped up by American money and by American aid, whereas the North, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, does get some support from the Soviets, some support from the Chinese, but the Americans are pumping much more money and military aid into South Vietnam than the North are getting from their friendly allies. Now, the problem with Diem was he didn't really want to have an election in 1956, and the USA didn't really want an election in 1956. And you can kind of get a sense of this because of the way that Vietnam had kind of developed post the French kind of leaving the country. If you now just think of two instances, Ho Chi Minh has kind of been responsible for kicking out the Japanese. He's now been responsible for kicking out the French. He is loved by the Vietnamese people, and that's people in the north and the south. There was even some suggestions that as much as 80% of southern Vietnamese people would have voted for Ho Chi Minh in an election, which would have united the country and made the entire country communist. So you can see why the Americans are opposed to this this election, and they ignore it. I mean, the United States just allows Diem to ignore it, and they carry on ploughing money into South Vietnam to build up military, to give it an opportunity to protect itself from any North Vietnamese incursions. What we should say here is America does not necessarily care if Vietnam is a united country or split into two. In the same way that after the Korean War, they didn't care if they have a North Korea and a South Korea. What do we still have to this day? North Korea and South Korea. And the Americans saw that as being a good way of containing communism. Don't let the communists win and take complete control of the country, because that's bad, that gives them momentum. If you contain them, it doesn't matter if you split the country. And Vietnam was really meant to go down the same route as Korea by just being split into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. But the Vietnamese in the north were not going to obviously accept that. Now, Diem's regime, right, so this is the guy who's leading the south, is not popular. In fact, Diem is detested. Now, not that it should matter too much, but he was a Catholic, right? He was, the French obviously sent lots of missionaries over to Vietnam over the time that they are there, and Catholicism really takes hold in part of the country, in large parts of the country. But Catholicism and Catholics are still very much the minority in Vietnam. It's a Buddhist country, and Diem's regime, which is a little bit of a corrupt cabal, right? It's him and his family that really run the country. It's not a proper democracy, and there's lots of corruption and gangsters within South Vietnam who can really get away with what they want. And as you might know from reading or watching movies about Vietnam, it's a place where there's gambling and there's prostitution, and it's a kind of slightly corrupt and decadent place, Saigon. And there's a lot of opposition to Diem regime, and it comes from communists and Buddhists and nuns and students and businessmen and intellectuals and peasants. The Americans are propping up a government that nobody likes. But Eisenhower and then Kennedy both believe that, well, Diem's not perfect, but at least he's not a communist. Now, what we see in under the Diem regime is some pretty bad decision making. And one of these examples of bad decision making was in May of 1963. You have got a Buddhist demonstration, and this Buddhist demonstration resulted in the ARVN, right? So that's the Vietnamese, Southern Vietnamese Army troops firing into a crowd, right? They killed 8 Buddhist monks, and then they arrest monks in temples, and then after that you even get a self-immolation of a Buddhist monk. I mean, if you really want to watch it, you can watch it in this little image. This is June 11th, 1963. Thich Quang Duc sets himself on fire, pours oil over himself, petrol, and his protest against the Diem regime. Now, this is obviously reported around the world, and here is what is pretty galling for the Americans to kind of accept. They are backing a government that is forcing monks to set themselves on fire. So it's not going particularly well for the Americans. They're throwing millions of money to try and prop up this government to stop it from falling to the North Vietnamese, which I'm going to come to in a second. And it's been pretty pointless, to be honest, right? It's just not doing what it should do. And the second problem, right, and the second problem is obviously linked with this problem, is that at the same time as the Buddhists are turning against Diem, Diem is also having to fight an insurgency, and the insurgency that's taking place is this uprising of southern communists who are trying to overthrow the Diem government with the intention of uniting the country. Now, this is where things get a little bit complicated, but if we go back to what I stated earlier on, and if you can recall how the opponents of South Vietnam are kind of organised, then you should be fine. But the North Vietnamese government decided in 1959 that they're going to try and support a guerrilla uprising of southern communists, right? So the Viet Minh, who are now called the Viet Cong in the south, the North Vietnamese government are going to support them in their attempts to overthrow the Diem government. So really from 1960 onwards, right, you've got the Viet Cong, or the National Liberation Front, infiltrating parts of southern society and sabotaging and carrying out attacks in an attempt to start a popular uprising in the south, which could lead to the overthrow of the Diem government. Kennedy, who's in charge now, right, in the United States, starts to throw money at it, right? He throws, 165 million in military kind of assistance and 130 million in economic assistance. Money is being thrown at South Vietnamese government infrequently, and eventually Kennedy decides he's going to send over advisors. He sends over 3,200 in 1961. In 1962 he sets up a group called MACV, right? MACV stands for the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, and MACV are really there. This is really the Americans telling the Vietnamese how you stop these Viet Cong carrying out attacks against you. And one of the things that the MACV also does is tries to train the ARVN, the South Vietnamese army, who had proven to be pretty incompetent. So Kennedy also has to respond to all of these developments, and he can either respond by allowing things to drift in the hope that South Vietnam can turn things around, or he can take a greater kind of intervention in the hope that maybe more American assistance can kind of help stop any potential popular uprising. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, right, Kennedy is kind of stuck with the Eisenhower approach, and if you look at source 4 in your booklets, you get a speech from Kennedy. This speech is from 1956, right? It's before he becomes president, but in 1956 Kennedy is basically mirroring exactly what Eisenhower says, and what Kennedy says in source 4 obviously tells us what he's thinking about in 1963. Vietnam, he says, represents the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia. Cornerstone, right? So it suggests that Vietnam is very important. If it's to follow communism, what would be the fate of the rest of that part of the world? And he then talks about, if you don't defend Vietnam, then Burma, Thailand, India, Japan, the Philippines, Laos, Cambodia are among those whose security would be threatened if the red tide of communism overflowed into Vietnam. So he's saying we've got to make sure that Vietnam is stopped from going communist. And then he carries on talking about political liberty, but he also talks about American foreign policy. And Kennedy says something very similar to Eisenhower, where he says, and you can read this bit on My City, you know, that there are economic benefits. And he mentions almost the same things as Eisenhower: rubber, tungsten, tin. So there's all, you know, as I said, so for those who might adopt a Marxist approach, they would say, well, this isn't just about America trying to defend a regime that is clearly corrupt from communism. This is about America trying to take control of this part of the world, arguably, and have great influence in this part of the world, so it can expand its its markets. Cuba had fallen to communism in 1959. There were communists in Laos. There were fears of Chinese involvement in Vietnam. The Russians had launched their Sputnik satellite. The Berlin Wall goes up in 1961. Was Kennedy failing in his Kennedy portrayed himself as being a real anti-communist, right? Was he failing in his attempts to tackle communism? Was Vietnam the place where he had to step in, where he had to intervene? He couldn't keep backing down. And as I say, Kennedy increases assistance, right? As I say, by 63, there are now more and more American advisors, right? It hits 16,000 advisors by 63. And I should say by this point there are 300,000 members of the Viet Cong located in the south, right? With obviously the potential for support for the Viet Cong coming from the North Vietnamese army. So Kennedy decides to kind of not completely get involved, but he does put forward the idea of more military advisors. So 16,000 military advisors. He takes this view that maybe you can't win this war, but like Eisenhower, you can contain it. And by giving more and more military advice and more money, eventually the South Vietnamese will get their act together and will be able to quash any rebellion. So that's the position. The historian's quote that I've given you at the very end of this slide is a useful one because it shows you how Vietnam wasn't important but came to be important. So it's a small country, agrarian, fewer than 15 million population, but it becomes so significant because it becomes a battleground between Marxist-Leninism and American free market capitalism. I should say, right, that the Marxist-Leninist idea is maybe pushed a little bit too far, both by some historians, who we call revisionist historians, but also by the American government at that point, because there wasn't really any evidence of Mao pushing the Vietnamese to act in a certain way, or initially Stalin, obviously before he dies, and then the Communist Party in Russia and Soviet Union. There's not really any evidence of them really pushing the Vietnamese to act in a certain way. The Vietnamese will take money from the communists in China and the Soviet Union, and they'll take weapons, and they get weapons from the Soviet Union, and they get military assistance by non-combat troops from China, so it would free up Vietnamese to go and fight against the South. But they are acting of their own volition, the Vietnamese. And so sometimes this Marxist-Leninist argument is maybe pushed too far. It's communist, but it's a certain type of communism. It's a bit more like Maoist communist ideas, and it's also an element of nationalism, in the same way that the Chinese always talk about communism with Chinese characteristics. Really, that's what you're going to be getting, which is a big dose of nationalism, right? Economic nationalism. That's really what you might have been getting within Vietnam. Vietnamese version of communism with Vietnamese characteristics. Okay, I very quickly want to go with some sources. Source 7, right, so these are the views of different historians, right, that I'm going to kind of throw at you here. Not necessarily always the names of historians, although I have quoted Smith here, but just the kind of two historical interpretation positions, which are revisionist and orthodox, and then you've got an extension of the orthodox position, which is a Marxist position. The revisionist case for war is that war was necessary, right, that the Americans had no choice to go to war, and that's Kennedy's view. Kennedy thinks that he can't back down If America backs down, also you have the potential for this domino effect, but something else worse could happen, and that would be, if I just click the next source, 1 second, and that would be America's reputation, right? And also that's something which Kennedy himself doesn't deal with, because, if we go back this way, Kennedy doesn't have to really worry about America's reputation because he's assassinated. Weirdly, he's assassinated a couple of weeks after Diem himself was assassinated, when things were going really bad in South Vietnam with these Buddhist uprisings and so on, and obviously infiltration by Viet Cong. The American government and Kennedy, who liked Diem because they were both Catholics, they both had some similarities, I guess. Kennedy kind of begrudgingly accepted that the military's view, the American military's view, that maybe it'd be best if Diem just disappeared. So when the South Vietnamese army, the ARVN leadership, think that they would quite like to get rid of Diem and put in place a kind of military government, then the Americans don't really discourage it. They kind of even encourage it. The problem was that America now was back in a country that just assassinated its leader and was by no means at all democratic. And as I said, it's Johnson, it's Lyndon Johnson who has to pick up the pieces. Hence why sometimes historians argue that Lyndon Johnson is responsible for the Vietnam War. It's Lyndon Johnson's war. America is not at war when Kennedy doesn't leave office, when Kennedy is killed. There's even some views, again you can read this on my site, that Kennedy was even planning on removing advisors. That Kennedy thought, well, maybe we can leave Vietnam. But I'm not convinced by that argument. But there are a lot of Kennedy apologists who like to think that Kennedy did nothing wrong, which is far from the truth, and that Kennedy, if he hadn't been killed, would have removed American advisors, I should say, from Vietnam. There actually were American troops in Vietnam when Kennedy's still alive, right? This is all kind of done secretly, I should say that. There's a battle in January 2nd, 1963, known as the Battle of Bac. Now this was technically a victory for ARVN, right, the South Vietnamese army, but because the Viet Cong have more soldiers killed, but the fact that the Viet Cong were able to bring down American helicopters and bring down and basically destroy American tanks, and some American advisors / soldiers were killed in this, it did seem like it was more of a defeat for the South Vietnamese, hence one of the reasons why Diem had to go. 1964, we get the kind of beginnings of the war, if you like, because Kennedy's assassinated in '63. Johnson becomes president. Johnson doesn't want to make it too well known that he is going to maybe escalate the war, because it's an election year, '64. He wants to win the election. He doesn't want to say he's going to send American husbands and brothers and sons out to Vietnam to fight. To be fair to Johnson, right, he is not keen on war. Source 5 is a really good source, right? It's a telephone conversation between Johnson and Robert McNamara. McNamara is really the man that many think is responsible for the escalation of the war, and McNamara kept quiet a lot of what was going on from the American population. But he was also a key advisor to Kennedy and Johnson. And in source 5, you can read, I guess, you kind of get a glimpse into the mindset of Lyndon Johnson and the problems that he faces. He doesn't want to run away from Vietnam, because if he runs away from it, he's going to be called a coward. And he also truly believes that if you run away from it, then maybe communism will genuinely start to spread. And that is part of the revisionist interpretation that you can see in sources 8 and 9, that America can't lose its credibility. There's pressure on Lyndon Johnson. You can see it in source 8 at the top here. Pressure doesn't just come from politicians in the United States, or from the American military, or from American arms companies. It comes from governments in other parts of the world who want the United States to do what they'd always done, which was kind of challenge any country that might be a threat to this part of the world, right? This is part of the American sphere of interest. So the Australians and the Kiwis, for example, are concerned. But the other issue is American credibility. If Johnson does decide to bail out, what will this do for American credibility? Will it make America look weak, and will it give the upper hand to communist regimes around the world, but especially the Soviet Union and China? America had to look, as Source 9 says, had to look like it was not willing to appease in the way that Chamberlain and the French had appeased Hitler, and it didn't want to look like it was no longer a credible force and a reliable ally. She had to ensure her allies that she could be counted on. This is the problem with becoming the kind of world's most powerful military state. At the very bottom of Source 9, and you can also see this in a little image once I go back to the slides, there is a note given to McNamara, Defence Secretary McNamara, from one of his advisors, McNaughton, and he breaks it down as to why America has to stay in Vietnam in some shape or form, and the biggest proportion or percentage is that it's to avoid a humiliating defeat, because if they were to leave with their tails between their legs, then what would that do to America's reputation? The other 20 and 10% really has got nothing to do with the reality, therefore. I mean, only 10%, according to the American kind of advisors at this point, was to do with improving the lives of the South Vietnamese. South Vietnam really meant nothing, it was incidental to the Americans. It was more about the bigger picture about America's role in the world. And obviously America's role in the world would be contrasted with the communist role in the world, and that would also be Soviet Union and China, and how they could maybe influence smaller countries around the world. So the dilemma that Johnson has when you read Source 5 is, what do I do? Do I stay or do I go? He eventually is given options, right? And you can read about this on My City. He's given options, and the options are leave, the options are escalate, or the options are escalate but only in a limited manner. And that is the option that he takes. That's why the United States are never truly all in Vietnam. The reason why they don't win the Vietnam War is because they don't go in to completely win the war, because if they do, they know that it would lead to the possibility of China getting involved. Maybe the Soviet Union, but more so China, and they also believe that if they do get involved, it will lead to obviously more death and more destruction, and this would obviously impact upon Johnson's ratings back home as well, if more and more Americans are killed in this war. So that is the kind of the revisionist view. Source 10 and Source 11 focus more so on the orthodox interpretation, and the orthodox interpretation contrasts what the revisionists say by saying, look, America just gets it wrong. What happens is they misjudge Vietnam, they misjudge the situation in Vietnam, and they didn't have to send troops in, right? And that's what we see, right? Troops are obviously sent in by March of 1965, even before March of 1965. In 1964, America has already started to bomb parts of Vietnam, really from August 1964 onwards, because there's a fear that America needs some type of justification for getting involved or escalating the war. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is when the American public really start to learn about what's going on in Vietnam more than at any other point. Most things have kind of been kept secret, but the Gulf of Tonkin resolution goes obviously to the Senate, and the Senate votes in favour of giving the president powers to retaliate against the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese army, and the North Vietnamese government, because at the Gulf of Tonkin it was alleged that 2 American ships had been fired upon by North Vietnamese ships. Only one, called the Maddox ship, had been fired on. The second alleged fire on a ship called the Turner Joy actually never took place. And also, why were the American ships in North Vietnamese water is another question that should be asked. But anyway, it was enough for Johnson to get the Senate to overwhelmingly back his resolution to retaliate against the North Vietnamese. And 2 senators decide against it. Actually, they vote against it, and these senators were anti-war senators, believed that this was a ridiculous war to be getting involved in. And from that kind of perspective, we get the orthodox interpretation. And the orthodox interpretation, if I now just jump to slide 10, is that, not a bit I've underlined, that the US responds to Gulf of Tonkin, or just to the situation in general, lacked proportionality. America did not have to. So although I've been saying America didn't go all in, right? America didn't have to go in at all, is the view of orthodox historians. That the US really believed that Vietnam was a threat, that domino theory really was going to take place. What a nonsense. Where is the evidence that if Vietnam felt with communism, that all these other places would? You have to remember that many of these countries that they're referring to were anti-communist, had large Muslim populations. The idea that they were going to all of a sudden become communist maybe shows the kind of recklessness or the paranoia of the Americans at this point. Or, if you adopt a Marxist position, the Americans knew that this wasn't going to be the case, but they wanted an excuse to increase their military might and power in this part of the world. And finally, one of the other key aspects of the orthodox interpretation is that the Vietnamese were not as communist as you might think, as is suggested here, but there was a major element of nationalism contained within Vietnamese communism. And maybe if the Americans had recognised that, if they had learned a bit more about Vietnamese history, they would have known that Vietnam was never a threat to the United States, that it was never going to try and export communist ideas to other parts of Southeast Asia. But America, according to orthodox historians, miscalculates, and therefore the war was unnecessary. When the Marines land in Da Nang in March 1965, I think it's safe to say that the Vietnam War is underway. The American people now know about the Vietnam War by this point, although, as we now know, as everybody now knows, America really had been involved in the war for much longer before this, but the American public were just not so clear on it. And General Westmoreland, who's in charge of military affairs in Vietnam, just asks every so often, he just says to Johnson, we need more troops, we need more troops. So by December 65 you get 200,000 Marines in Vietnam. By 69, 500,000. America just gets dragged further and further, deeper and deeper into the jungle and into this war. And once she's here, once she's in this war, the story then becomes about American conduct during the war, which is not required for any assessment of this topic, but it's definitely fascinating. And the one thing that I would definitely encourage you all to examine is the My Lai massacre, which is referred to in the final section of the My City online book on the Vietnam War. And this is where the American military, this is not a command from the top, right? This is American military acting on the ground themselves, a small group of American soldiers who not only just kind of torch a village, because that was quite common, right? It's part of the methods of war, and contaminate water sources and whatnot, and slaughter livestock. But they also engage in just the murder of villagers, women, children, who are lined up out along ditches and are shot into these ditches. Another aspect of American history that is often not referred to when it comes to the Vietnam War. The My Lai massacre eventually would get some attention at the time, thankfully, but it's not always necessarily remembered, and it's a genocide up there, or a form of a mini genocide, if you like, of the Vietnamese people, because it was really these troops who carry out by this point have been to some extent contaminated by the kind of racist views that start to spread. Now, some of these racist views are a product of the very fact that they see their own men being shot by the Vietnamese, and so there's a real hatred directed towards the Vietnamese instead of hatred directed towards their own government who have sent them there in the first place. But it's up there, My Lai's up there with, I guess, Ballanghiga, and with the massacre at Wounded Knee, another example of the American military carrying out atrocities. To be fair to the American government, this was not a state-sanctioned decision, and that is really that's really it. The last slide has just got two little documentaries that you can watch if you're interested in this topic. By no means at all is this compulsory. And what these two parts, that's based on a historian who writes a book about how the war in Vietnam was a kind of military/business war, where success was based on body count. and it's a really kind of interesting analysis. And some of the stories in here are pretty graphic. It really shows you the horrors of war and why the Vietnam War is not one of the glorious wars in American history. Hence why there was a little bit of a resurgence of kind of Vietnamese or Vietnam War history in the 1980s with movies, but a lot of these movies were pretty racist as well, and some of them were kind of pro-military. But the better ones showed you the complexities of war, and how war and being sent to war was or did have a real negative impact on these soldiers who were going there without really any knowledge of why they were there and what they were doing, and hence why many of them questioned war. In fact, many veterans came back and were anti-war, even as the war was still going on. They were anti-war, and this is something that Harold Zinn picks up on if you read Zinn's chapter on the Vietnam War. Okay, that is far too long in the lecture, so I'm going to stop speaking now. But yes, there is much more on My City for you to read if this is an assessment question you opt for. Thank you.